Hi everyone, it's Lindsay, and today I have a fun and easy technique to share with you. It's all about adding string art to your handmade cards. This is a great way to add some interest and texture to your cards, so let's get started. First, for my cards, I need card bases. I am working on A2, so 4¼ by 5½ inch top folding card bases. And I created 3 card bases for this video. This technique will work on any size card. You can find this free printable that I'm showing here over on my blog. It breaks down how to create all of these different card bases, and tomorrow I will be adding a slimline page to the download as well. So be sure you check that out. I will have a link to that page down below, as well as my entire freebies page where you can find this and a lot more card making information there as well. I also created my card bases from 110-pound cardstock. Now I have my card bases ready to go. The first card I'm going to be working off of a panel. So I'm going to set the card base off to the side. This panel is slightly smaller than an A2 card base, and it measures 4 inches by 5¼ inches. This is going to give me a place to hide the back of my stitching and start and stop my thread easily. I'm creating a scene on my first card, something I really miss doing. I'm first going to do any stamping and ink blending that I need to do before I start stitching. The stitching does add a bit of bulk to the back of the panel, so it won't lay completely flat, which isn't a great place to try and stamp. So it's good to get this part out of the way before you do anything more. Now, I have not done any ink blending lately. This is the first time in a very long time. So you can see I'm a bit rusty. Even though I'm using my Amazon makeup blending brushes and Distress ink, it's a little choppy. But I have a fix. If you're like me and your ink blending just doesn't look 100%, go ahead and spritz a little water on it. You can add a few water droplets like I did here and let it sit for a minute. Then I just used a microfiber towel and I dabbed up the water. This adds texture and hides those imperfections in the blending. Now, like I said, I used Distress ink here, which is reactive with water. Make sure you're using a water-based ink for this technique so you get those nice little droplets and that nice effect that you're looking for. Once all the inking and stamping, anything that I wanted to do to that panel was done, it was time to get ready for the stitching. On each of my cards today, I'm stitching around an opening. You don't have to do this, but I like the way it looks. For this card, I die cut a smaller circle in the top right-hand corner, and I kept the circle itself too, so I could use it as a guide for where I wanted my holes for stitching. I'm using my Big Shot and just a regular old circle die set for this. You can also use a circle hole punch. That will work just as well. Like I said, I kept that circle, and that is going to be my guide for placing down my holes. You can freehand the holes, but I wanted mine to look a little more uniform, so I used my ruler and drew some lines around the circle, making sure that each one went through the center. I'm using my Tim Holtz ruler for this. This is one of my favorite tools. You can use any ruler you have on hand, and you don't need to be careful with your pencil marks. This is just going to get tossed once you're done, or you can flip it over and use the other side if you keep your die cuts. I added quite a few lines. This is totally up to you at this point, how many holes you want to work with on your panel. Okay, a quick pause and a warning. Now we're going to be poking holes into our paper. You have to have something under your cardstock to protect your work surface. You can use an old magazine, a notebook, phone book. I myself am using a double layer of thick fun foam. And to poke the holes, I am using the Tim Holtz retractable pick tool. This tool is sharp and does a really good job, but you don't need it. You can also use an embroidery needle, which you'll need for the stitching anyway. I'm just using the pick because I have it, and I have a better grip and control than I do with the needle. So now it's time to start poking the holes. Again, I use that circle with the pencil marks as a guide, which is really helpful and kind of takes the guesswork out of it. I'm staying about 1/8 of an inch away from the die cut edge. You don't want to poke the holes too close to the die cut edge. If you get too close, you run the risk of the paper ripping when you start stitching. It can also start to bend up on you. So use a thicker cardstock. The thicker the cardstock you work on, the better it holds up. You can use a thinner paper, but it does have a tendency to kind of bend up on you and rip. So just be a little more careful if you do use that thinner paper. Again, I am using 110-pound weight cardstock for my project today. Also, just to keep myself from slipping up and poking myself, I have taped my panel down to the fun foam, and I just use low tack painter's tape for that. And once all of my holes are poked, I can go ahead and remove that circle, set it off to the side, and it's time to start stitching. For stitching, I will be using embroidery thread. It's thick and strong and comes in a lot of different colors, so it's perfect for this technique. To keep today's video simple, I will be pulling all of my colors from this pack, which is available on Amazon, and the link to it is in the description box below. It has all your basic colors, plus some fun tie-dye threads, which are cool and look great on cards. I'll show you on a finished card at the end of this video with one of those variegated threads. You may already have some embroidery floss on hand. It's super cheap, only around 60 cents for a skein, and comes in so many different colors. I have quite a selection, and I really like the DMC floss best. While we're here, I'll show you how I store mine. It's in a fishing tackle beading storage box. They're super cheap. It can go by a lot of different names, so just check your local craft store, maybe even your local sporting goods stores. Then I just wrap my skeins around these plastic bobbins, again, super cheap, and I write the floss name and number on the top so I can know when I'm running low, which one I need to pick up when I'm at the store. Okay, so on to this first card. I am going to use yellow floss, and this is from the pack that I shared, that tie-dye pack. Again, it has all those basic colors in it. This open space is going to be the sun in the scene. To start, I secured the thread to the back of the panel with some regular old Scotch tape, and then it's time to start stitching. Here is where you can go so many different ways and really get creative. There are a lot of different stitches and patterns you can use. I went very simple. So what I did was I'm starting with a manageable length of thread here, and I'm coming up through the back of the hole. And I'm bringing that thread to the front of the panel. Make sure you're taking your time here and you're not letting your thread get tangled. It does have a tendency to do that if you're not careful. And once I brought it through the front of the panel, I'm going to go straight across from that first hole that I came through and go right back down through to the back of the panel. Now, instead of going right across to the next hole, I'm actually going to skip over to the hole closest to that hole I came through the back on and pull my thread right back through to the front of the panel. Then from there, I will go straight across to that next hole, and I'll keep repeating that process all the way around twice. Now, the reason I am not stitching on the front and the back, or doing that string art on the front and the back, is to keep the main bulk of the thread to the front of the card panel. Now, this is just one way you can do the stitching. You can choose to stitch any direction or way you want. It really is just about having fun and doing what looks good to you and your design. In this case, I thought the stitching would look like sunbursts with the stitching the way it is on this card front. As you're stitching, you want to be sure to keep your string from getting tangled, like I said, but you also want to make sure to keep your string nice and taut. You don't want it hanging loose, but you don't want to pull it so tight that you rip the paper. So just be aware of your tension and how hard you're stitching. Take your time, have fun with it. Also, I said before, you can do your hole punching with an embroidery needle. That is what I am using to do all of my stitching today, is an embroidery needle. These needles are a little bigger and thicker and handle the embroidery floss a lot better. I don't know if you could stick embroidery floss through a regular needle. But these do come in metal or plastic, and they come in different sizes too. So if you don't like the huge ones, you can go with a little bit smaller one. And if you want to do this project with kids, you can get plastic needles, which is a little bit more safer than these sharper metal ones. When the stitching was done, this is how it looked. And to finish it off, all I did was use some more Scotch tape and secured the end of that thread to the back of the panel and just trimmed off any excess so it doesn't hang out the sides. It really is that simple. And here on the back, you get a better look. When you stitch on just one side, you really keep the bulk to the front of the card and not on the back. And that's going to be a little bit of an issue when you go to add your adhesive. So just keep that in mind if you decide to stitch on both the front and the back. So now the stitching's done on this card, it's time to go ahead and finish the rest of it. I added a little bit of yellow ink to the card base, right behind where that sun is going to be. This just made it look a little bit more like a sun, which is what I was going for. I used Distress ink in Squeeze Lemonade and a mini ink blending tool, and I protected the edges of the card base with low tack painter's tape to keep them nice and clean. For this panel, I did want to go ahead and pop up the back of it. I added some foam adhesive to the back. Whenever you're adding adhesive, just be sure that you aren't covering any of those holes, especially if you're using liquid adhesive, then you're going to have that tendency for the glue to kind of seep through to the front, and you don't want that. So keep the adhesive away from those string holes and keep it away from your opening as well. Like I said, I am using foam dimensional adhesive for this. You do not have to use dimensional adhesive. These can lay pretty flat, so you can use regular tape adhesive or liquid adhesive if that's what you prefer. Now also to finish this card, I wanted a lot of texture, so I die cut some clouds from some white craft felt, very cheap stuff that you get at the craft store, and I attached that with more foam adhesive around that sun. I also die cut some grass from regular green cardstock and attached that to the bottom with more foam adhesive. Then I used a Hugs die cut, and that is my sentiment. I die cut that from black and built it up about 3 cardstocks high and glued that onto the front of the card as well. I love the way this card turned out. It has so much texture and interest with the different fibers and colors. It's really fun and creative way to take your scene making up a notch. On to the next card. Instead of die cutting a circle, I'm die cutting a heart for this project. I went a little bit bigger, as you can see, and I don't have a ton of space around the edges of this heart. Be careful when you die cut and leave yourself a little bit more room. This is doable and I made it work, but it wanted to pull and fold very easily, even with that heavyweight cardstock. So just be aware. If you want to work in larger openings like this, it might be a good idea to layer up 2 or even 3 layers of cardstock to make it a little bit more stiff and more unlikely to bend and pull. And just like before, I am using the same process. I use the heart die cut itself, a ruler, and a pencil to create a guide for where I want my holes to be. I'm making sure that each one of those lines just crosses through the center, and I added quite a few more on this particular heart just because it is so big. Then I laid it right back into that opening, and I'm working over that double layer of thick foam sheets. You can work over a notebook, you can work over a phone book, you can work over magazines, you can work on a mouse pad. Just make sure you have something under there to protect your work surface. And I started using that guide that I made to start poking my holes. Now here you can really see I don't have a lot of space on the right and left side. Layer up those pieces of cardstock. This is a little bit cumbersome to work with. So once I had all of my holes from my guide, I felt like I wanted even more. So I went back through and punched one in between each one of the holes that I had already put into my paper. So you can really get creative, add as many or as little as you want. I wanted more, so I went back in and added more. Stitching this card, I used fuchsia thread that was from that same tie-dye pack that I showed in the beginning. I first taped down the end of the thread to the back of the panel. When taping down the end, just be sure you're close to where you want to begin stitching. This is just going to use less thread and make it easier on yourself. And again, I am using the same stitch I did on the previous card. I started at the bottom point of the heart and came up through that hole. Then after I pulled my thread through, I inserted my needle into the top of the heart and pushed the needle back through to the back side and pulled my thread through back there. And just like I said before, I want to keep that bulk to the front of the panel. So instead of just going back down to the opposite hole, I'm going to go ahead and skip over to the next hole and pull my thread back through to the front of the panel, making sure I take my time and I don't tangle up my thread. I think I got a little bit long with this one. Just go shorter and rethread. It's not that big of a deal when you're working like this, and it makes it more manageable. So once I went ahead and brought that through, I went down to the opposite hole, the one right next to the first one I started with, and I'm coming back through to the other side of the panel. And I just kept that same stitch going all the way around. Now on the first one, I did go around twice just because I wanted to bulk it up a little bit. It was a smaller opening. It was a smaller space. For this one, I have a lot of holes. I have a larger opening. So I am just going to go around once. Even though I'm going around only one time, this is still going to take a lot of thread. I am going to need to rethread my needle multiple times. It's really simple to rethread this. Once you run out of thread, you can't go any further. Just go ahead, detach your needle, and then take some Scotch tape and tape down your thread to the back of the panel. Make sure you are ending up on the back. You don't want that tape to be on the front of the panel. So I'll go ahead and tape that down to the back. And then I will start just a new piece of thread right where I left off. Now on this particular panel, because of the way I'm stitching, I do want to start exactly where I left off. So I'll go ahead and tape my piece down very close to that hole where I need to come back through. And then I can just start stitching again. And this same technique works if you want to just switch up the thread you're using and use 2 or 3 different colors. Now, like I said before, this piece was a little bendy. And if this happens to you, adhesive is going to be your best friend. So what I did was I made another opening onto the card base and lined that opening with a pretty strong tape adhesive. You could try liquid adhesive, but I think tape adhesive really works best in this situation for that instant bond. Then I carefully laid the string art panel over the opening, making sure to take the time to line up the 2 openings. You might need to stretch and pull that opening a little bit. This is just going to help that lay a little bit more flat. Make sure that that string is pulled nice and tight. Then I went ahead and added even another layer behind this for more support. So I added more tape adhesive, and then I am just going to add a whole panel behind there. I'm not even creating an opening. I'm just going to give it some nice support behind there. If I would have started with 3 pieces of cardstock glued together, I wouldn't need to do this, but I went a little overboard. So if this happens to you, it's a quick fix. You don't need to throw it away. Just go ahead and add that panel behind and in front for extra support. Now, this was a little bit of a happy accident. I love the way it looks with the white behind it, and it has a little bit of a different look because all of those holes are covered. So it looks like it's just a bunch of string taped down in the middle there, which I love. Now to finish this card, I added a stamp sentiment from a stamp set that I designed. I drew this stamp set. This set is called Thankful for You, and it's from Joy Claire Stamps, designed by me, and I will make sure to link it down below. I used the Hello My Friend sentiment and VersaFine Claire ink to finish this out. I did use my Misty to do the stamping since I already adhered the cardstock to the finished card. A stamping platform is a great tool if you are like me and forget about stamping sentiments. It just makes sure you don't screw up your entire finished card once it's completely done by just misstamping your sentiment. Now I like my Misty, which is what I am using here, but they are pricey. So I'll link a few more affordable options as well down below, as well as my Misty that I use. Now, even with all the mistakes that I did do on this card, I still love the way it turned out. I think the stitching looks really neat on this one, but it's not my favorite. My favorite is this next one. It is a lot of fun, and I wanted to be sure that I made a card that anybody could make, whether you have dies or you don't. So for this card, we're using basic supplies. To make my opening, I am using my paper trimmer. Now this is nice because it does have the ruler on the cutting arm itself, so I can cut right out of the middle of this. Now you can also use a craft knife, which is what I plan to do, and just a regular steel ruler, but I have lost my craft knife in the move, so it was my paper trimmer. It's all I had to use. I made it work, so you can too. But if you have a craft knife, that might be a little bit easier. I started with a full A2 size panel, so 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. Then lining up my blade at 3/4 of an inch from the bottom, I cut up to 3/4 of an inch from the top. The ruler on that cutting arm makes this super easy to do, and I just repeated that process all the way around. And just be sure you're keeping everything lined up and use that ruler as your guide, and once you're done, you'll have a cute little frame. Now onto the hole punching for this. You can do the same method that we did before, but I am actually going to be using my Tim Holtz craft ruler to create my little holes along the edges. I punched the holes 1/4 of an inch from the inside edge on that panel. If you don't have a ruler like this, again, just use a regular ruler and pencils and that same method that we used before. Or you can freehand it. But I will say, if you are going to be doing a lot of paper crafting, this is one of those tools that is pretty inexpensive, but it's one of my most loved and most used tools. Now, moving on to the sewing of this card, I'm doing something different. I wanted to use one of the variegated threads that is included in the tie-dye pack of embroidery floss. They're really beautiful and they add a lot of interest just on their own, so you don't need a whole lot more on your card front. Now, any of the variegated ones would look beautiful. I am using this navy, teal, and orange and purple one, but any of them will work. And what I did was I taped down the end to the back of the card with regular Scotch tape. And that's just going to hold it tight so I don't have to worry about the end pulling through. And then I pulled up my thread through the front of the panel. Now, instead of trying to make some design, I'm just going to be really random here and just go down through another hole and just keep doing that. So just keep stitching very randomly on this one. Now again, I'm keeping that art to the front of the panel. So once I pull to the back, I'm going to go ahead and just pick a hole close to that one and come back up through it just to keep all the major bulk of the stitching to the front of the card panel. Now, out of all the stitching, this way is probably my favorite. It's really mindless. You don't have to put too much thought into it. You just kind of go with it and just keep stitching and stitching and stitching until you're happy with it. There's no right or wrong way. It's just what looks best to you. And you don't have to use all of the holes. I put quite a few in here just because I wanted a lot of options. And if the open holes bother you, like they did me, I will show you how I fixed that. But I just kept stitching and stitching and stitching until I was happy with the look of the panel. Now, just like on the other one, I did need to reload my thread a few times. You just do it like you did the other ones. Once you get to where you can't stitch anymore, you pull off your needle and tape down the end of the thread to the back of the panel with Scotch tape. Then you just start a new thread. And with this one, you don't have to be careful about where you start it. You can start it anywhere you want since you're being really random with the pattern. Just be sure that you don't tape over any of those holes so you don't have to try and poke through them. You might need to cut your Scotch tape to do that. And also be sure that you trim off your ends so they aren't hanging out the edges of the card panel once you're finished. Now with this opening, I did have a little bit more room around the edges, so I didn't have to be so careful. You still want to keep your tension nice and tight, but I kept flattening it out on my work surface as I was stitching so I didn't get a bunch of weird bends and cracks in my cardstock. Now, I just kept stitching and stitching and stitching until I was happy with the look of my panel. And like I said before, I didn't using all of those holes. I didn't want to leave them open. You definitely could, but I wanted to fill them in. So I decided to add a frame. I am using some black embroidery floss from that same pack, and I am just going to do a quick back stitch around the entire panel. I'm not going to do any crazy stitching across. I'm just doing a back stitch through each one of those holes to create that frame. Back stitching is very easy. There are a lot of great tutorials online. I'll show you how I did it. This may not be completely right, but it's what I did. So I started by coming up through a hole. And again, you want to make sure you're working with a manageable length of thread and make sure you're keeping it untangled. So pull your entire piece of thread through that hole. Then I'm coming back down through the hole that was before it. So you don't want to go on to your next hole. You go backwards and go through the hole behind it. Then once you pull through that hole, you want to go through not the next hole to bring your needle back up. You want to go through, skip a hole, and then come up through the next one. And that's going to give you that space to back stitch into that hole that was the previous hole. I hope you're watching the video because I am not good at explaining this, but there are a lot of people that are good at explaining it. So if you want to learn how to do this for real, go watch one of their videos. You can look and see how I'm doing it. It's pretty simple. I just repeated that process all the way around the panel until I had this really great black frame. And then again, I just clipped off the end and taped it down to the back of the panel to secure it. I love the way this frame turned out. It just added that little something extra and filled in all those extra holes, so I felt it looked like a more completed card. Again, I wanted this card to be something that anybody could do. So to finish this off, I am just going to pop this panel up onto an A2 card panel. This is top folding. Again, you can download that link where it teaches you how to make card bases over on my blog. That link is in the description box below. But I'm just attaching that panel onto the card base. Now in doing this, you want to take your time, make sure you're lining up all of those edges because you have that tension on the string. It does kind of have a mind of its own, so just make sure you're coaxing it into the right spot, lining it up, and securing it down. That's why I think tape adhesive is really the best for these projects. Now, for the sentiment, I am using one of my old stamp sets. This is one of my favorites. So it's from Paper Smooches. I don't even know if it's still available. That's not the point. The point is to just use a sentiment. You can handwrite it. You can type it and print it. You can use a wooden stamp sentiment from the dollar bin at your local Michael's store. Whatever you have on hand, just put a sentiment on there, whatever the occasion is. And then I just put it onto a regular piece of cardstock, and I am just cutting out a banner using some scissors. I cut an angle on it, and then I'll use my paper trimmer to just trim off those extra edges. If you don't have a paper trimmer, that's not a big deal. Use a craft knife or use your scissors. It really is just using about what you have on hand and making a card to send. I wanted to use those strings to kind of hold the sentiment in place. So all I did was attach some adhesive to the back edge of that sentiment banner and just tucked it under a few strings and secured it down to the edge. It looks as though the strings are just kind of holding it in there, but it does have that little extra support of the tape adhesive. I left the end of it just floating, kind of hanging there. I like the look. You could also secure it down if you wanted a little bit more secure, but that's the card. Really nice and simple. All it is some stitching, some holes, and some cutting and stamping. Really, really simple. So you can go intricate with this string art or you can go simple. It's all about using what you have and having fun with it. I had a lot of fun making these cards. These are the first ones I've made in about a year. But if you guys use this technique and you share it on social media, be sure to tag me so I can see your work. I would love to see them. And if you are interested in any of the supplies I used or shared today, they are listed down in the description box below. Thank you guys so much for watching today. If you haven't subscribed, you can do that here. Happy crafting, everyone.